سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the next two parts, we're going to speak about something which is very important and at the very time quite controversial now, and that's the issue of the Hilal. What are we talking about? The Hilal? The Hilal is the start of the new month, which for most of us we're a little bit oblivious to for the 10 months of the year in particular, but when it gets to Ramadan, it's a particular time where we are very much interested to know when Ramadan starts. And we've had the experience over the years where according to some Ramadan has started, according to some Ramadan hasn't started, and likewise at the end of the month and beginning of Shawwal, then we have the difference of views as to whether it's Eid or it's still Ramadan. So we have a problem where some of us are celebrating Eid and the rest of us are still fasting. And likewise, when we get to the Eid of the, as we refer to as the big Eid, then we have similar discussions. But the main issue tends to be at the time of Ramadan. So today's episode and the episode which follows, we're going to discuss this. Why is there this difference? What's going on? Okay, so again, this is based on a paper that I've already published, as I did with the Isha and Fajr times, and this paper is referred to as the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK, and it's available at the Institute for the Revival of Traditional Islamic Sciences, which is www.irtis.org.uk. So that's IRTIS, which stands for the Institute for the Revival of Traditional Islamic Sciences. And again, if you go to the top banner, you'll see a number of papers there, and the one that we're going to be talking about in today's episode and in part 2 is going to be the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK. So we know that the calendar that we follow is referred to as the Hijri calendar, and that's followed by Muslims across the globe. Certain months obviously carry more relevance. I've already mentioned those to you. For example, Ramadan, Shawwal, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, especially when we're trying to find out the 10th of Muharram. And therefore there are religious acts within these. But other months are also important. For example, on the issue of talaq and things of that nature, where a woman doesn't have regular menstrual cycles, then she's counting the months in that way to determine when her iddah is complete. Now, we're going to restrict ourselves in today's discussion and in tomorrow's discussion with the definition of observation rather than astronomical predictions. So we're not going to discuss groups or positions based upon astronomical predictions. And the reason is twofold. First of all, we want to maintain the focus of this study. This paper itself is in excess of 50 pages, just under 50 pages, and that was keeping it relatively brief. So if we then opened up the study to go beyond observation, then we're going to be talking about 100 or so sides, and nowadays we're finding it's difficult for writers to write for that length of time, but worse still, it's difficult for readers to maintain concentration and read through 100 or so pages. So that's why it's being kept at that. And secondly, which is more important arguably, so I'm not sure why I put that secondly, is that it's got to be legally sound. And legally sound, as we will see through the discussion, has to be based upon the term ru'ya, to sight. So one matter which is clear from the outside is this is now politically motivated. I didn't say that in the short abstract blurb that I started with, but it is politically motivated, and I'm not talking about amongst the general public, I'm talking about now within the community of ulama, sadly, and it's spilled out into the general public. And conclusions are jumped to without looking at the legal position which is being adopted, which is very much so as I discussed with the issue of Isha and Fajr times. So for this reason, I've tried my best to keep, where possible of course, I've kept names of organizations and individual scholars. I haven't mentioned them. I've kept that absolutely a minimum unless there was no choice. So in a way, I'm adopting, as I've called it, the Tahawi approach. Imam Tahawi rahmatullah alayhi had a remarkable approach for his time when he was discussing a book, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, in which he discusses the points of view in terms of coming to a decision and putting arguments for and against without necessarily naming who is for that position or who is against that position, and only at the end, in the conclusion, he brings that. So that's what I will try to do where possible, as I've said. I'm not going to mention supportive or counter fatwa either, because then again this would go way beyond the remit of the study. We'd be a mound of 3 inches of, if not more, of a text to read, and people can read them at their own pleasure, and they can access them that have been amassed on this particular point. So for 2 reasons: one is valuing each fatwa is extremely difficult, adding a value content, a value measure of value to it. And secondly, obviously, each response is based upon the particular situation at the time, so it's going to be time dependent. And these are difficult to validate, and they are considered beyond the remit of this paper. So the paper will be structured by discussing each position, and that will be titled position. The criteria will be stated with supporting evidence following on from that, any argument against another position, and that will be brought on any counter arguments without going into excessive detail. And I have used a large number of texts, which, as you would find in a normal academic paper, you'll find that in the bibliography, which starts on page 44 and goes through to page 47. But having said that, many texts I found were not titled and not dated, hence it was very difficult to reference, very difficult to even acknowledge, because that's just the nature of the beast. So referencing has been carried out as normal academic standards, and the aim of the paper is to attempt to not overtly link organizations and personalities' legal positions. It's just to bring the message so it makes you have an informed understanding, so you can make an informed decision. So let's move on to the second part, which is looking at the legal positions. And what I've done is I've given 3 positions as such. Okay, so position 1, and I will go through what this is their criteria. And position 1, or those who adopt position 1, they say astronomical data cannot be used in any capacity. So as a result, it will not be utilized to determine which night to seek the hilal. So we're not talking here about, as I mentioned in the introduction, that astronomical data, because even within this, the remit of this paper is we're not discussing astronomical observations. We're not using astronomical data to determine the start of a month and the end of another. What we are talking about is astronomical data not being used at all, even as a guidance, even as a way to determine whether it is physically possible to sight that particular moon. That's not going to be taken into consideration, nor can it be used to negate any sighting as well. So evidence from our hadith is brought to support this position, and is based upon the understanding of that, we are not people of measure, we rely solely on sighting, we're not a community of science with respect to this particular issue. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's declaration of the hilal is the most appropriate for all Muslims to follow, is the view of position 1. It is difficult to regularly sight the hilal in the UK, as is evident due to the clouds and everything else associated with it and its proximity on the earth. So as a result, we must look beyond our shores. Morocco's unreliability in the past was the reason why the switch was made to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or KSA for short, originally. Also, that it states that the moon should be attempted to be sighted after a number of hours, and South Africa is being considered as a non-option because it's a non-Muslim majority state which lacks the legal remit for Muslims outside of those regions to follow it. With mass media, many individuals are declaring these new months without the need to consult scholars, as announcements are made on satellite channels, on websites, on the internet. So therefore, we're against the current anyway, so doesn't it just make sense to just go with the flow and use the KSA method? The methodology KSA applies is through citing by any number of witnesses, no fixed number is given, and those statements are then legislated by the legal body. So that's position 1. Position 2 is considerably different than position 1. It starts with efforts should be made to sight the moon locally. So there is a desire to sight the moon locally. If this proves difficult, as is expected, then any country to the east, which has a legally valid method of determining the start of the moon, will be utilized. So a slight difference there now, you can see it coming through. The possibility of sighting has to exist, and this is the term of imkana ru'ya, that it must be physically possible to see the moon at that time, meaning that the moon is born and the moon is sufficiently large, and I'm not going to start using technical terms, and I'll try to avoid those technical terms throughout the paper, because the paper is there for those technically minded who want a more deep understanding. This is for a general sort of publication, general release, so most people can get a basic understanding of what's going on. So imkana ru'ya must exist. It must be physically possible for humans to be able to sight it. That could be A, that the moon is born, and it's of a certain age for it to be big enough to be seen. It hasn't set before the sun has set, or it hasn't set quickly after the sun has set, because then again it's near impossible to see. So there's certain things which make it physically impossible to see, and therefore if somebody makes a claim, then it's most likely erroneous claim, because it's not physically possible to see it. If a claim of sighting is made, particularly if it's an isolated report, one or two individuals, even though hundreds or thousands of people have gone out, then this needs to be assessed against astronomical data to validate the witness statement. And that's key as well, because the confusion which exists is this view or conflation that exists between the use of astronomical data to actually remove accurate sightings. So it seems that the position one, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it seems appropriate to mention it here, that position one feels that any use is incorrect, whereas position two is saying no, we're not actually challenging the sighting. What we're challenging is the witness statement, because it's the qadi or his substitute who then declares that to the public, and the qadi is at will to decide whether he wants to take a witness statement or not. He's not compelled by anybody, but as again, it's not usually a qadi, it's usually a board of individuals who are acting as a qadi. That board are not compelled to take any witness statement if they feel the witness statement is unreliable. That could be either due to questioning, like where did you actually see the moon, and he's pointing in a completely wrong direction, it was not possible to be seen there, or whatever. A statement is made by the position 2 adherents that if there was a large number of individuals who bear witness that they are sighted, then the hilal will be accepted, okay, even though it is physically impossible. So they're clearly mentioning that if there's a large number, then the witness statement will be given priority over the astronomical data. Sighting will all be considered valid if made by a large group of witnesses. So this is jama kathir or ghafir, and we'll see that in due course when we speak about the madhaib. Declaration from KSA will not be considered due to their unreliability, and that the witnessing which is approved has been based on one individual, which is not correct in certain cases, or two individuals, which is not correct in certain cases. Again, we will see that in due course when we start to discuss the madhaib. Significant evidence by many independent researchers has shown the invalidity of declarations due to months of the year following calculated astronomical data and reliance upon one or two witnesses declaring the sighting. Finally, we move on to position 3, and position 3 is not too dissimilar to position 2. The first of the month should be declared on that day which does not go against the Sharia, intellect, and the obvious matters. So it's bringing other things into place, the intellect. If something is unsound, then we're not compelled to accept that, and obvious matters mean which is clear to see for all. Each locality in the UK should have dedicated individuals who regularly attempt to sight the hilal. However, these individuals must know in which part of the sky the hilal will be present, meaning some training is required. Based on point 1 of position 3, the individuals should be notified that it is the 29th of the month. If on the 29th of the month the hilal is not sighted, then in this case news from countries that are not ahead of us in terms of a date, as in that they're not on the 30th whilst we're on the 29th in the UK. In other words, the country where news is sought from must also be the 29th. Also, the country should be applying the principles of the Hanafi school, which is important since most of the adherents within the UK are of the Hanafi madhab, even if they are nominally. And its methodologies. Furthermore, the moon sighting committee of that country is satisfied, meaning because they are representing as the qadi. So because this is a different political domain, because this is a different diyar, because this is a new jurisdiction, then other countries do not have legal jurisdiction within the UK. It is the moon sighting committee with respect to moon sighting in the UK which has a legal capacity to be able to pass judgment, know the judgment. And this is important because much of what we're going to discuss here is about the book on judgeship, It's not much to do. Well, there will be the points obviously when it comes to citing, but the key part, especially for the UK, is because we tend not to be able to cite it, news is coming to us from the outside. And as news is coming to us from the outside, as in outside of the UK, then it moves into the area of judgeship, comes out of the area of citing, and the area of judgeship rather, has key criterion, directives in terms of how you would reach a decision. One of those is point 5. There has to be a contractual agreement between the UK committee and the committee of the country the news arrives from. The news must be first hand and not from another source. So a contractual agreement to allow Kitab al-Qadi ila al-Qadi, to allow the writing or the information of a Qadi from one country or one area or one jurisdiction to a Qadi of another jurisdiction, and how he's compelled or otherwise to accept it. Point number 6 is, as for the other months except Ramadan, contact made via telephone or written format must be verified that it is the said individual who is informing. Once all the checks and balances are carried out, then declaration can be made. If news reaches the public from another country, then it is not appropriate to assume that the month has started. Rather, they should wait until the UK committee makes an announcement. This is addressed to the public. So when the public receive the news, it is not permissible for them to start fasting, because fasting is a declaration. Has to be declared, and it is the Qadi who declares it. It's not just by news coming, because when news arrives, it is the Qadi's responsibility, or the substitute, which in our case is a moon sighting committee, to carry out thorough research in order to validate the information. Once it is validated, they then will make the declaration. If witness statements of the Hilal are contrary to external factors, then they may be rejected, meaning that it's physically impossible to sight the moon. He's looking in a completely different direction than when the moon should be. Similarly, if a transgressor's witness statement correlates with external factors, then it may be accepted by the committee, which in certain circumstances a transgressor's sighting may not be accepted. But because it's actually validated by physical reports of the moon being born and being of a certain size, then it will be fine. Waiting for news from overseas has to be declared after a fixed time period. It can't be declared immediately. So if news does not reach the committee from overseas within the time frame, then the month will be considered to have 30 days. This fixed time period will be up to 2 hours after Maghrib in that country. So what we have is the 3 positions. Okay, 3 positions. Position 1, let's just summarize it. Astronomical data is a complete no-no. We can't sight the moon in the UK, so we shouldn't even bother sort of going out. The KSA is the most appropriate to follow. We can't go to Morocco, because Morocco was the reason why we moved to KSA, because it was unreliable. We can't go to South Africa, because South Africa is a non-Muslim majority country, and therefore, and also mass media, internet, people are well aware that Ramadan has started in Saudi Arabia, so it just makes sense. So it seems a sort of a practical, sort of a nice and easy approach to take. Position 2, position 3 were similar, seems more detailed. Sighting initially is local. If local is not possible, then something called imkana ru'ya must exist. The possibility to sight the moon must exist. If that does exist, then witness statements can be taken. That tying with that, even if we get isolated, that can be accepted. If however they contradict this, then one would have to see the size of the group in order to validate that. There has to be some kind of agreement in place between the two. Position 3 seems to be more detailed, but we'll move on from there. So position 2 and position 3 is moving away from the view of position 1, and position 1 is the following of Saudi Arabia's declaration. And this was decided in a meeting way back in 1986 on the 28th of December, when it was decided that Morocco's declaration was unreliable because of the speed of the declaration that people were receiving. So it was agreed back in 1986 to move. So we're talking, over 30 years ago now, where that decision was made. However, as is argued by individuals in position 2 and position 3, and as we'll see here, position 1 is untenable and unreliable, and this is the argument that position 2 and position 3 put forward. But what we'll do is, rather than jump the gun, let's put up the evidence in front of you to explore position 1's invalidity. Well, we have the case, as I've also referred to as a KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia dating system. And there was an old criteria which went up to 1419 Hijri, and that Saudi Arabia adopts the actual previous years. It was very clear to the public as well as the astronomers that most of the Saudi months were wrong if the actual sighting is the basis for the starting of the Islamic month. And then we have the Jordanian Astronomical Society receiving a telegram from the highest religious council, Majlis al-Ifta al-A'la, showing the basis of the Saudi official calendar. And here is the translation of the telegram, and it reads: "We wish to thank you for sending us your greetings of Ramadan and for reminding us of the date of the new moon of Shawwal for the year 1418 Hijri. We would like to remind you that determining the first day of the Islamic month is like determining the prayer times. And the aim of His Almighty from these times is to inform us not to take it as a worship. It is adopted in al-Qura calendar that if the moon's age at sunset is 12 hours or more after the new moon, then the previous day is the first day of the Islamic month. Since the Islamic day starts at sunset and the night is before the daylight, as well as the time of fasting is in the civil daylight. May Allah accept your worship. May Allah bless this Ramadan, thanking you for your good cooperation." So here you can see that as long as the moon's age at sunset is 12 hours or more, then that's the month has started. There is no sighting. There is no evidence for sighting. It's mentioning that particular point there. And that was from, and this is, and there's a copy of this you'll see in the document. So we can see that was, but then we saw a change after, because it was due to the pressure the Saudi authorities were coming on under. There was a change made, and that change was made in 1420 Hijri. So starting from 1420 Hijri, Saudi Arabia starts the lunar month if the moon sets after the sun on the 29th day of the previous month as seen from Mecca. So you can see now there's an improvement. Clearly an improvement before post 1419. Much better is that the moon was set after the sun, because it's only going to be possible to be seen if it sets after the sun. It's not fantastic yet, but it's still a prediction, but it's better. So it still ignores the crescent visibility, which is obviously very important. Can the crescent be seen? That's because, as we'll get to the hadith, it is referring to ru'ya. Also, at certain months, they begin the month while the moon is not yet in conjunction. Not in conjunction is a new moon. And the setting of the moon after the sun does not always imply that the moon has reached conjunction. And we have a statement from the Shura Council in which they mention this new criteria, and you can see that there. And there's some discussion along those sorts of lines. We then have another change which takes place in 1423 Hijri. Again, an improvement. So you can clearly see that there is a problem with the Saudi system. You can clearly see there's a problem, and it is because of this problem that you're seeing changes taking place. So we're on now 1438, if I'm not mistaken. So this is now going back 15 years or so. So in the early sort of 2000s. We have a new criteria, which is the current criteria as we speak to you today. It says now that if on the 29th day of the lunar month, the following two conditions are satisfied, then the next day is the first day of the new lunar month. First, the geocentric conjunction occurs before sunset, and B, the moon sets after the sun. Again, key point missing is ignores the visibility of the crescent. So it's still using physical data, but ignores rather. Now this is based on the al-Qura calendar, and we're mentioning this even though some may say, well, hold on, in certain months ru'yat is carried out. So why are we mentioning this? Because it's important. We'll pick this up later. I had a number of correspondence then with the discussing with say with respect to the Islamic declarations, and I got the very same point here, which was thanks for your email. Here we are following the announcement of the court for all lunar months. Our al-Qura calendar is based on the following two conditions. The conjunction must be before the sunset on the Holy Kaaba, and the moon sets after the sunset on the Holy Kaaba. If these conditions apply, the next day is the first day of the new month, otherwise it will be the last day of the old month. Best regards, and then the individual from the KACST was the one who signed it off. And this was a private email between me and him on the 13th of June 2015. And then there's a blurb in there as well, which mentions what the criteria is and how that's been devised. The KACST, for your information, is the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology. So we're seeing here, and then there's another area of confusion, is that there are a couple of declarations by Saudi Arabian organizations which state that observations are made without the use of calculations. We have Wizara al-Hajj wal-Awqaf that states either by eye only or through the use of equipment at the observatory, and that's dated 1409 Hijri. And in the second case we have Al-Riyasa al-Am lil-Buhuth al-Alamiya wal-Ifta, and they state that its unaided sighting is used and no change in the method has been reported. So we can see a contradiction there itself between the two organizations, and they are actual documents that I have that I've included within that, and that's one of the interesting parts, and I will probably say good parts of the paper, as I'm not going to speak ill of it, is that I've managed to record these information from the actual sources, because as I said, it's very politically motivated now, so in order for individuals to look at this themselves and sort of make their own minds up. So 2 points can be ascertained from this statement. Point 3, which is already been mentioned, considers valid the sighting of the Hilal using observatory telescopes, but also that this is appropriate because establishing the Hilal is prioritized over negating it. So that's interesting, because there seems to be a desire to push the observers or anybody who's going out to see the moon to sight it more than not sight it, if that makes sense. Point 6 also highlights within this document, you'll see that I've sort of scanned and put in the article. You'll also see that the point 6 highlights the use of sharp-sighted sighters. Okay, definitely not someone like me, who have had experience in the past of sighting the Hilal to determine this Hilal. So again, there's a push towards sighting it. So it seems that there's great esteem and great reward for the person who's going to be the first one to point it out. And that, we'll discuss later as well, has a psychological impact on the individual who's looking at it. On the other hand, the Ahnaf speak about average eyesight individuals of correct vision, as Imam Quduri mentions in Al-Mawsu' al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya al-Maqarana al-Tajrid, and there he says, فَأَمَّا الْعَدَدُ الْكَثِيرُ فَلَا بُدَّ أَن يَكُونَ فِيهِمْ جَمَاعَةٌ يَتَسَاوُونَ فِي حَدِّ النَّظْرِ وَصِحَّةِ النَّظْرِ. That this large number, it's necessary amongst them to have a group of average, similar, equal in eyesight and correctness of vision. There's no need to have somebody who has extraordinary eyesight. Again, I've saw evidence from many individuals as to where this declaration of Hilal is made. I spoke to many people in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia trying to get this information as to, where is this declared? As yet, nobody could provide me any information. So there's a number of conclusions we can come to. One is that the declaration does not exist, because if it existed, it would be there. And if it does, the news is not readily available. They're the two potential options through deduction. In fact, discussions with Dr. Al-Mustafa clearly show that the announcements are only made for Ramadan to Muharram, that is for 5 months of the year. And I have, again, posted there for your benefit a discussion on Facebook between myself and the esteemed doctor, and with respect to, when I said where do I find the information, his response was they don't announce except for Ramadan to Muharram. And then I said, where will I find that information? So I said, oh, why is that? He says, I'm not sure, was his response. And that discussion took place on the 7th of July 2015. However, it's an improved position, because on the 1st of June 2010, there were only 2 months which were being announced. And you can see that because there's a link that I've given you to a YouTube video in which after, 6 minutes onwards, that particular point is mentioned. So again, you're seeing that the system is improving, but improving very, very slow. And in the meantime, people are declaring Ramadan and declaring Eid based upon that. Again, when Dr. Mustafa was pushed, he could not find where these declarations are being made and why the other months are not being declared. And then we have this resolution from the Islamic Fiqh Academy, which is what is expected from the process. I'm not going to sort of quote it out to you in full. Suffice to say, it says on point 4, Rabi'an, which is on the top of page 15, it does point out, this is point 4 on top of page 15, it points out that the need for a unified calendar for the Muslim world. However, it is argued that this would not apply for months with extra religious significance, namely Ramadan, Shawwal and Dhul Hijjah. So the argument is given is that we do need a unified calendar in the Muslim world for civil purposes, for purposes in order to be able to travel and in order to transfer money and things of that nature. But this would not apply for those which have extra religious significance, and that the ones they've included there, Ramadan, Shawwal and Dhul Hijjah. What it's arguably saying here is that because they're important in that fasting is starting as Shawwal and Dhul Hijjah, then in those cases we do need to try to have a more appropriate method. Okay. Here then there's another link to another video which mentions the discussion which was held about the practice of declaring the new month, and it contains the views of the Saudi scholars that sighting should be conducted. So there is an argument that sighting should be conducted. So in February 2012, it was announced that the news of months other than the Ibadah months, which is the months of worship, or where there's more worship rather, so Sha'ban, Ramadan, Shawwal and Dhul Hijjah, was proving difficult to gain from the Mahkam al-Ulya. And they had taken over from the Majlis al-Qada al-Ada 3 years earlier, who had taken over from the Wazirat al-Waghera. So you're seeing that you're getting these different organizations stepping in and arguably improving on what was already existed. And so it seems a little bit of a sort of a mix-up. Hence it was agreed that Qur'an, the calendar should be followed, which is based on astronomical calculation. But it was justified in this case. Now let's not forget, this is position 1's position. Okay, and position 1's position was, point number 1 was quite clear: astronomical data cannot be used in any capacity. That was their main point. Yet, they're left with very little option because of the lack of information coming from Saudi Arabia in months outside of those 4. They have left with no choice but to follow astronomical calculations. And this was justified by saying, the al-Qura Islamic civil dates are nearest in distance to the pure Islamic Sharia Rasmi dates as practiced by Saudi Arabia rather than by other Islamic civil and Rasmi dates, because they do not take place, or rather, just missed something there because that didn't make sense, because they do not place, rather, that's better, conditions of a minimum criterion as used by other countries. Clearly, position 1 is going against its own criterion, which is criterion number 1, which should mean now position 1 is flawed. We see another example that this is proved is that sometimes the month is started. So we have an example here on Jamad al-Thani in 1436, which is only a couple of years ago now. And this was on March 2015, and this was a couple of months before I published this paper, which was July 2015, and it was probably at the time I was writing this paper. So it's not as if I had to dig deep in order to pick something up from years ago to show the problem. But we saw here on the 1st of Jamad al-Thani on 1436, and we see here that the pre-calculated al-Qura calendar says the 1st is on a Saturday, but the Saudi High Court, which corroborates rather with the 21st of March, and then the Saudi High Court backdated, and they came out with the 2nd, which was the 22nd of March. So you're seeing a 2-day difference, a day difference rather, between the pre-calculated, which is what position 1 is advocating now, to what the Saudi court says. So now you're starting to get problems. So you're going to end up with 31 days in a month, which is clearly impossible, because the pre-calculated date started a day earlier. So if this is a 30-day month, Jama'at al-Thani, if it was a 30-day month, then the people who would follow the position 1 would have had 31 days, and 31 days is impossible. So you're seeing two problems here. Going against his criterion, which is then causing problems when comparing with the declaration. A question then was put to Dr. Al-Rafai, who is the in charge or a senior member within the KACST, and he was replied that yes, the Hilal sighting on the 29th day will be on Sunday the 19th of April, according to the highest court announcement. So this obviously shows an error in between the two dates that I mentioned to you earlier. So we're starting to see the problems and why position 2 and position 3 have come about, because of the concerns that we have with position 1. But it doesn't get any better. Another point, which is what I discussed as well, is on the psyche, is knowledge of information prior to the event can affect the observer's psychology. And this is point 3.2 on page 18. And Cordy, he carried out some extensive research collating data of observations for the new month of Ramadan between 1962 and 2001. And when he compared these with the official civil al-Qura calendar, he found that 35 out of the possible 42, in other words, over 83% agreed with the civil calendar. Now, he knows that the civil calendar is incorrect because the civil calendar is not based on the possibility of sighting the Hilal. It's based on the conjunction of the Hilal over Kaaba and that the moon sets after the sun. That's all it's based on. And that's the best criteria that we had, which was after 1423 Hijri, if I'm not mistaken. Yet you're seeing such a fantastic correlation between the two. What is that suggesting? Well, this led him to the obvious conclusion that prior knowledge of the supposed beginning of Ramadan via the civil calendar increases the psychological element in what is a difficult observation, leading to a large number of reports of false observations. Of these 35 that we've said that correlated out of 42 with the al-Qura, and the al-Qura is not based on the possibility of sighting the Hilal, of the 35, 24 occurred when the moon had already set before sunset. Because remember, this was 1962 to 2001, so it wasn't even using the 1423 Hijri, which is about 15 or so years ago, which would have brought it about 2002, 2003. So therefore, the sunset wasn't a criterion then. So 24 had occurred when the moon had already set before the sun. So that means it was impossible to see it, because if the moon has set before the sun, what are you seeing? Or it was impossible to see. And 3 were also seen in Syria. The 7 which did not agree with al-Qura, so there was, remember, 35 out of 42 did. The 7 which didn't, 4 sightings were the month of Sha'ban, was 29 days, 2 which made 30, and 1 where it became 28 days. So even there, it was problematic in one area. This extensive study, let's not forget, this is between 1962 and 2001. This extensive study clearly highlights the psychological effects on the observer if she is aware of dates or the possibility before they carry out observations. Especially when there's that desire, as we've already seen, not to come back with a negative sighting. In fact, to sight it is like you've achieved something. So there's also that push, which I touched upon earlier as well. 3.3. Those months which are termed religious months, namely Muharram, Ramadan, Sha'ban, and Dhul-Hijjah, start by a sighting which is unreliable. So the author has seen a large number of fatwa which refute the use of astronomical predictions for the Hilal. However, it could be argued that these predictions are those which make no use of sighting or decide which day to go look for the Hilal. But position 1 utilize these fatwa to argue against the other positions, but are forced to adopt them themselves due to delay in announcements for the other so-called non-Ibadah months, as detailed below. And there's a number of incidents which are here, and I'm not necessarily going to go through them all, because I think the point has been made, in which there's a catalogue of such events concerning the sighting which are seriously problematic. Hilal sighting for Eid al-Fitr in 2009, 1430 Hijri in Mecca. The research of the ulama of Turkey with respect to the declaration by Saudi Arabia of Eid al-Fitr 1399. Excuse me. The 1st of Muharram 1412 declared in Kingdom where there was a solar eclipse in Hawaii. So it was not impossible. And the 1st of Rajab declared when there was a solar eclipse in America. A number of newspapers that challenged the declaration, and I'm not going to go through them all. Hilal sighting in Saudi Arabia, first-hand report by Dr. Salman Sheikh, where he spent 5 years in there, and he discusses what he actually saw and what he tried to do in order to change this. And we see his statement in full here. So we're beginning to see a case building up against position one, and a very strong case at that. The next point, which before we sort of disappear for our pause and get to part two, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia followed the Hanbali school in some form. And this is relevant because the majority Muslims follow the Hanafi fiqh in the UK. So therefore, is there a difference in the Hanbali madhab compared to the Hanafi madhab when it comes to declaring sighting? Now, I've quoted a large section of a reliable, trusted upon Hanafi text there. And in here it mentions that the Qazi has a choice of whether to accept the statement from a solitary witness. So this is the Hanafi madhab. The reason he can refuse is because of accusing him of error. There are a number of ways the Qadi can reach this understanding, and one cannot exclude astronomical data as one of those which could lead a Qadi to reject the statement. On an overcast sky, then the Qadi will accept the statement of a solitary witness. This is over and this is referring to Ramadan only. So in Ramadan, or when Ramadan is about to start, the Qadi can accept the statement of a solitary witness if it's a cloudy sky. He is not compelled to, but he can. On a clear sky though, the witness statement will not be accepted until a large group of people testify. The reason why a solitary report will not be acceptable now is because it is considering the sight to be erroneous. In other months outside of Ramadan, then 2 male witnesses are required at a minimum if the sky is overcast. So you see a change there. So only Ramadan, in an overcast sky, can 1 be accepted. The reason why I'm highlighting that, because the Hanbali madhab accept 1, whereas the Hanafi only accept 1 sighting when there is no, only accept 1 sighting when it's an overcast sky. The Hanbali school, which is recorded here from Al-Insaf, do not take into consideration whether the sky is overcast or not, so it's irrelevant, which has a major repercussions on the position of the Hanafi. Rather for Ramadan, a solitary just male witness will suffice, and in other months it will be 2 male witnesses once the Qadi accepts their testimonies. There's going to be a clear difference in cases where it is a clear sky, as 1 witness will suffice for the Hanbali school, but will not be accepted in the Hanafi school. Why? Because they will require a large group of people. And this is where, if you remember, position 2 and also to a certain extent position 3 mention Jama Kathir or Ghafir. That when you get a situation, it's a clear sky in Saudi Arabia, 1 witness will be enough for the Qadi to accept the witness statement. Once he accepts the witness statement, then that will suffice, and he can declare the start of Ramadan. However, if that witness had approached a Hanafi Qadi, then he would not be able to accept it, because this one must clearly have made a mistake, because the sky is clear, there's hundreds of people looking up at the sky, and how is it that he's the only one who's seen it? The only reason he accepts it in the overcast situation is because it might be just as he's looking up, there's a break in the clouds, and he catches the Hilal, and then suddenly, just by the time he's trying to gather his fellow colleagues around with him and bring them around to point it to them, the clouds have then covered the Hilal again, and then by the half an hour or so later the moon sets and it's not seen. That's why the Hanafi will accept 1 solitary witness only for Ramadan in the time when it's an overcast sky. But only for Ramadan, they cannot accept 1 when the sky is not overcast. It will have to be a large group of people who will witness that. This is important to understand. And I have, for the sake of completion, added the Maliki school and the Shafi school, and there's no real difference there. 2 male witnesses are required, and based upon their witness statement, it will be considered correct for the Qadi to pass judgment and declare the start of the new month, and the Shafi position is no different. Next, we will just touch upon these last few points before we finish off. There are times when an Islamic month date is repeated on 2 separate days. Another problem that we're finding with adopting position 1. We see, for example, that the 29th of Safar 1433 and the 1st of Rabi al-Awwal 1433 was on the same day, which was the 24th of January 2012. We know why that's happening, because the position 1 are left with no choice but to follow al-Qura calendar. And then what's happening is the courts, the Saudi courts, are declaring days after, backdating, so to speak, the start of the month, which is then either falling on the same day as the al-Qura, as the start of a new month, or separate. And that's where the issue is coming up. And that's happened in other cases. One of the experiences on Friday the 28th of December and Saturday the 29th of December, they were both called 19th of Dhul Hijjah. And clearly we're seeing problems. The efforts to cite the Hilal should take place locally. Okay, it's not appropriate to rely on citing of another country unless there's a necessity. By adopting KSA declarations, one is relinquishing one's responsibility too easily. The validity of the declaration has to be the locality one lives in. Then once that's been exhausted and there's no possibility, then one must go outside. The fact that there's already, clearly we're just going to follow the al-Qura calendar throughout the year, and then for the Islamic months, the Ibadah months, we're going to follow the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia statements, is already suggesting we're not going to go out to look for the moon. The means by which the declaration reaches the UK is not Sharia compliant. Remember, I mentioned to you that this is Kitab al-Qadi ila al-Qadi. This is the Qadi. Well, is it really? Does the Qadi write to the committee, or does somebody find out, make a phone call? Is there actually a relationship between the two moon sighting committees? For the months when the Saudi High Court is not making any announcements, position 1 supports the view of following the al-Qura calendar, which is what we've already said. However, this is also problematic as accessing the data can be difficult. One such episode was in Jamad al-Thani 1436, as discussed above. That was a little point that I showed you, which you saw the on page 16, where we saw the image that I put up for you. And the start of the month was based on the date selected by the KSA ministries, which is based on the al-Qura calendar and incidentally a number of news outlets. Hence, it is a case of gaining the information from their respective websites, but does not meet the Sharia criteria for declaring the start of a new month. The means by which news reaches the UK, especially during the so-called non-Ibadah months, is non-existent because it's just following a calendar. Instead, announcement is not followed, but the al-Qura calendar is followed. The following is an extra on which methods can be legally utilized for declaration and the starting of a new Islamic month. So what is allowed? Well, the 4 methods mentioned apart from witnessing the moon itself are shahada. Okay, so that's witnessing itself. The second method is shahada ala shahada, a witness who actually witnessed the witness, if there's not too many witnesses going on there. Shahada ala al-qada, witnesses who were there when the Saudi courts made the declaration, and those witnesses reached this new Qadi. So either the witness themselves goes to this new Qadi in the UK, which is not going to happen. A witness who witnesses the witness comes to this Qadi in the UK, which is not going to happen. Or a witness witnesses the Saudi courts making the declaration, and they come to the UK Moon Sighting Committee, which is not going to happen. And then something called al-istifada. Okay, al-istifada. And this requires some discussion. And the discussions that it brings about, which is mentioned in Radul Muhtar, is that it's the news reaching the Muslims via means of communication will suffice, as the Muslims in this country will be acting upon the ruler's decision. In the case of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the courts are acting on behalf of the king. Therefore, we can see that there is a legally valid way that the news reaches the Muslims in the UK. However, the news should reach the UK committee through many channels from various sources to be correct according to their Ghalib al-Zan. And that's what's mentioned, and there's some detail regarding that. So one would expect that the starting of Ramadan and start of Shawwal could be demonstrated by the presence and absence of the Taraweeh, respectively via the satellite channels and the number of phone calls received by family friends if they are centralized at the UK committee. However, news of Sha'ban and Dhul Hijjah is relayed to the UK committees by one individual, hence it will not fulfill the criterion of istifada. Only Ramadan will and Shawwal will, because we all put on our TV sets or phones or tablets or laptops and we can see people praying Taraweeh. But again, the UK committee has to make that declaration. Those who adopt the position 1 can make that declaration. So there seems to be some validity there. Be very, very grey, very, very weak. But in the other months, it's non-existence. So these are what the position 1 or the issues are within position 1. In part 2 of this the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK, I will discuss position 1's responses and rebuttals to this argument that's been put to them. So they will have their responses and then there will be rebuttals to those responses. And once that is discussed, I will then be able to bring this to a bring this to a close and bring some conclusion on this particular topic and give some recommendations as to how to best to move forward. So I hope you can click on the next part or wait for the next part to come out and watch the concluding episode of the Islamic calendar according to Muslims in the UK. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضل